Today we're talking about extroverted feeling and mainly the perspective that Carl Jung brought onto this function originally. As you all know, there's various different interpretations and ideas that are kind of connected to the main point that Jung made in psychological types. And I think pretty much all of them are valid and they kind of help us integrate and have a better understanding of the function. However, today in this video, similarly to how we discussed about a week ago in terms of extroverted thinking, I'd like to bring the same idea to extroverted feeling, okay? So that's what we will be discussing about today. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So, when it comes to extroverted feeling, Carl Jung starts by kind of defining the fact that this function is entirely connected and related to the object. If you're not familiar with his original description or characterization of extroversion as a general concept, Jung refers to it as a process or a tendency that allows the person to identify through the object or to identify with the object. And this object can mean anything that is outside of the person, so people, situations, real objects, whatever. And this is the case of extroverted feeling as a process as well, as it allows the person that uses this function either as a dominant function or auxiliary function or parent function, to have a similar kind of relationship with the outside, okay? And I'd like to kind of draw the distinction here between what we refer to as objective versus subjective, right? Because generally speaking, we see feeling as a subjective process because it looks at feelings and values and so on and so forth, not necessarily at cold logic or data, right? And a lot of descriptions do tend to associate feeling with the subjective factor. However, in Jung's original description, he definitely drew a connection between all extroverted functions and their objective nature. And that's because they refer to the object, they refer to the outside, and they're not so deeply personal as the introverted functions are. So just to clarify, this is what I mean and I will be talking about in the next few minutes. So, Jung said, feeling in the extroverted attitude is oriented by objective data. The object is the indispensable determinant of this kind of feeling. It agrees with objective values, right? So if you remember from the previous video where we talked about extroverted thinking, we talked about how this function is really interested in defining a clarifying principle that can apply to as many situations as possible, to as many people as possible. On the other hand, extroverted feeling does a similar kind of thing, but it looks at values. What are the values of other people? What are the values of society? What are the values of the groups that I'm part of? And so on and so forth. And in Jung's opinion, in Jung's description, this kind of dictated the objective nature of this function because it was concerned with something that was slightly more impersonal, right? The values of others rather than the values of myself. And I'd like to give you a little bit more, a few more quotes from psychological types. Jung specifically said, if one has always known feeling as a subjective fact, the nature of extroverted feeling will not immediately be understood, since it has freed itself as fully as possible from the subjective factor and has instead become wholly subordinated to the influence of the object. Even where it seems to show a certain independence of the quality of the concrete object, it is nonetheless under the spell of traditional or generally valid standards of some sort. I may feel constrained, for instance, to use the predicate beautiful or good, not because I find the object beautiful or good from my own subjective feeling, but because it is fitting and politic so to do. And fitting it certainly is, inasmuch as a contrary opinion would disturb the general feeling situation. A feeling judgment as this is in no way a simulation or a lie. It is merely an act of accommodation. And I think this is a beautiful, beautiful description because it shows that FE types, specifically FJ types, are very likely to evaluate certain people or situations or whatever based on what is socially appropriate. And I'm not saying that other types might not do this. We are all part of society and we are all influenced by a society to a certain extent. It's just that with high extroverted feeling comes a higher pressure to fit into the values of the group or the society that we are part of. That's why a lot of FJ types report to be very malleable, very flexible when it comes to their relationships, kind of losing themselves in those relationships, because this function makes them so prone to understanding the values of others that they kind of have a lot of difficulty figuring out what is in me that is stable, what is in me that is mine. And this is exactly what Jung is describing here when he says, I may feel constrained to use the predicate beautiful or good, not because I find the object beautiful or good, but because it is fitting and politic to do so. So he shows how this function makes one very, very prone to understanding what everyone around needs, what everyone around values, what everyone around feels, and kind of adjusting the self through various different things. And here by self I mean, you know, the descriptions that we make, the things that we say, the way we interact with other people, etc., in order to adapt or accommodate for that, okay? And I know this kind of description or enunciation might cause you to feel like, oh, extroverted feeling is a bad thing, right? Because it makes us not true to ourselves. But honestly, in a, let's say, general description, it's kind of a neutral thing. Of course, as with all of the other functions, it can be taken the good way or the bad way. And I'd like to go a little bit more into detail for that. Jung also says, this kind of feeling is very largely responsible for the fact that so many people flock to the theater, concerts, church, and what is more, with correctly adjusted positive feelings. Fashions too owe their existence to it, and what is far more valuable, the whole positive and widespread support for social, philanthropic, and such like cultural enterprises. So he basically shows how the good side of this function is that it helps people connect to each other. It helps people form bonds, certain rituals kind of that they do together, like going to the church or theater or concerts, what he mentioned here. But also other things where people kind of connect to each other and feel happy with each other. Because even though other cognitive functions can also help us relate to others in certain ways, extroverted feeling probably carries the most of the weight when it comes to doing that. Again, Jung says, without this feeling, for instance, a beautiful and harmonious sociability would be unthinkable. So far, extroverted feeling is just as beneficent and rationally effective as extroverted thinking. Basically, because both of these processes are concerned with decision-making processes that fit the group. Extroverted thinking comes from a more rational perspective, forming a principle or a formula that applies to as many situations as possible, whereas extroverted feeling does a similar thing, but when it comes to one's values and what is important to a certain group of people. Okay? In that sense, of course, we can also call it subjective, what a lot of people do when they talk about feeling. But this is basically what we need to keep in mind when trying to understand whether this is an objective or a subjective function. However, of course, there are certain drawbacks to this particular process, using it excessively, as it is with all of the other cognitive functions. And I really like the description that Jung made here as well. He said, for when this happens, so the exaggeration, extroverted feeling draws the personality too much into object. The object assimilates the person, whereupon the personal character of the feeling, which constitutes its principal charm, is lost. Feeling then becomes cold, material, untrustworthy. It betrays a secret aim, or at least arouses the suspicion of it in an impartial observer. No longer does it make that welcome and refreshing impression the invariable accompaniment of genuine feeling. Instead, one sense a pose or affectation, although the egocentric motive may be entirely unconscious. So I know the description is a bit complex here, but what comes out of this is that, well, when one gets lost in this function, and this would be particularly the case of ESFJs and ENFJs with FE hero, but sometimes also ISFJs and INFJs, they might get lost into the object. In this case, the object is other people's values and feelings and social norms, right? And if one gets so lost in that, they are very likely to, on the one hand, ignore their own needs and their own problems, etc., which obviously is never a good idea. But on the other hand, it also makes the person appear, what is basically Jung's description here, it makes the person appear rather cold. Because usually we do associate FE with like being warm and kind and open-hearted. But I think Jung is very right in the sense that when this function is used excessively, when it's imbalanced, it makes one very detached, very cold, and kind of routinely saying things just to kind of fit the picture, or just to make sure that they tick things off a list when it comes to social interactions. It's as if they have a pressure to conform to those social norms, or there is a pressure to connect to people in a certain way, or to talk to people a certain amount of time, or whatever that might look like for the person. And because of this pressure, of course, the interactions become much less genuine. They don't have the same impact and the same warmth, the same authenticity. And that's why this kind of feeling makes one appear quite robotic in nature. And I think it's a very, very, very good description that Jung put here, and I feel it, I really feel it. Again, he says, such overstressed, extroverted feeling certainly fulfills aesthetic expectations, but no longer does it speak to the heart. It merely appeals to the senses, or worse, to the reason. So he shows how basically if one exaggerates the use of extroverted feeling, doesn't temper it with introverted thinking, one completely gets lost into these expectations and social rules without really offering that genuine warmth and connection that the function can really bring when in a healthy, natural state. So yeah, these were my thoughts, an interpretation of Jung's writing about extroverted feeling and psychological types. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you think about it, whether there's anything else you'd like to add or ask or clarify or whatever it might be. I know that the description might not be exactly the same as it is in other places. As I said, we have multiple systems that we try to understand FE through, a lot of TI systems around. And yeah, in some ways we agree with each other in the definitions, in some way we don't. But I think it's extremely important to keep in mind that there is no absolute truth here, and that all of these perspectives are useful as long as they do good for us. All of these perspectives can complement each other and can stimulate different types of thinking to converge. So keep an open mind, try to see what you can learn from each of these angles. I'm doing my best to bring to you quality information about what Jung was originally describing, as I think Psychological Types is an exceptional book. And yeah, see you next week with a video on introverted thinking, where we'll be describing how this function comes from the perspective of Carl Jung. So thanks a lot for watching this video. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next week.